Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from CUI. Welcome to City Talk. It's midday here in Toronto, and we are talking today with participants who are in the European time zone. So it's sort of late afternoon there. So much so that one of them has actually produced an appealing libation to accompany her participation today, which she'll show you when I introduce her. But I just want to say that we're very, very excited about this session, and it's going to be very, we started City Talks 5 weeks ago. This is our 22nd, and maybe it was 6 weeks ago. Time flies when you're having COVID. And it's been interesting for us because when we started, it was kind of grim and rainy, and now it's a gorgeous weather is starting to come. And so we'll be interested to see whether people will continue to sign on to City Talks or whether they're going to, in fact, prefer to be outside in the nice weather, and maybe they'll be watching us late at night. But that's great, because the good thing is we tape these sessions, and so people can go back and watch them later and have an opportunity to benefit not only from what the panelists say, but also all the fascinating comments that are offered in the chat. So if you're coming into City Talk for the first time, welcome. We get several hundred on these things, and which we're delighted about, because we all need to make sense of what we're experiencing and what we're seeing. And today, we're so fortunate to have 4 folks who are going to speak to us about particular things they're seeing in the cities that they happen to be working in, but they're all expat Canadians. And so that's a thrill for us, and to have them joining us. I'll lay out a little bit more about each of them when I call on them, but just to say that these candid conversations, we videotape them and then we post them afterwards, and we hope that everyone will continue to participate with us at #CityTalk, because these are really intended as the beginning of a conversation, not the end. And it's an all hands on deck moment. As we know, at CUI, we've put up some platforms during COVID so we can actually watch what's going on in cities and share. City Watch Canada, City Share Canada, and this one is City Talk Canada. And we always want to acknowledge that this is no substitute or intended in any way to distract people from thousands of Canadians that continue, and people in the cities that these folks are working in, who continue to be focused on saving people's lives and keeping people safe. And that is the number one task. And municipalities and communities have been on the front lines, and they continue to be on that going forward. So we always want to acknowledge that. The other thing is that we're originating today in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe and the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples from across Turtle Island. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, which were signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. And we are conscious of our heritage and our ancestry, and we as settlers, what our obligation is to trying to actually come to terms with and reconcile with the history that we have. And we are hoping to have more Indigenous participation in sessions. I had an inquiry from someone yesterday who wants to put together a particular session on how this is being experienced in key Indigenous communities, particularly urban communities around the country. So that'll be coming up. Today we have these 4, and the Canadian Urban Institute is 30 years old, and it's led international programs for many years. In fact, it was founded in 1990, and a lot of its work for the first 2 decades was international work around urban development and sharing Canadian expertise about how we build communities and cities with other parts of the world, particularly when the Berlin Wall fell, and different parts of Asia and the Caribbean. And 2 of our participants today were actually interns on a CUI project in Jamaica, which is terrific. And we're Danny and Nicole, and we're just delighted to see you. You know, I have only been in this job for a number of months, and I continue to run into people who of varying ages and stages who will say, oh yeah, I did an internship at the CUI, or I had a project with the CUI. And I think that, you know, CUI is in the connective tissue business, as people on these webinars know I emphasize. And we have been doing that for years, and now we're getting really explicit about how do we create peer-to-peer learning opportunities of city builders working in different places, so that Charlottetown can learn from what's going on in Nelson, and how do we actually accelerate our capacity to adapt and be innovative. And that's what we've been doing during COVID, is trying to create opportunities for that, for us to learn from each other and hopefully adapt more quickly. So that's why we're so happy to have you 4 on, because we know that you're going to give it to us straight, what you've been seeing, what's been working, what you think hasn't been working, and then what do you see as the implications for urban life? You're each in different sectors. I don't know your backgrounds. I'm hoping you're going to tell me a little bit about that. I don't know whether you have training in particular discipline, or whether you're a generalist like moi. But we're interested to hear from you, why you're where you are, how did you get there, and what have you been doing, and then what are you seeing? As I said, thanks for coming on. And if people who are listening, if you could in the chat function, please, if you could direct your comments to panelists and everyone, so that everybody gets a chance to see what you're saying, because what we find is in these chat functions, these chat boxes, lots of people answer each other's questions and they put up great resources. And the old adage, just remember, what goes in the chat stays in the chat, because we post the chats so afterwards. So just be careful what you wish for. If you're going to put something in that chat, it's going to stay in that chat. The other thing is, we'd love to hear where you're watching from, because we have participants here from other parts of the world and 4 different cities. Why don't you check in and just tell us? I see Nadine, for instance, is checking in from Riga. Great to have you, Nadine. And great, so people are starting to do that. It's helpful for the panelists to see, but let's all just see who our community is. The other thing is, I just want to acknowledge that CUI continues to have an international program with something called the International Urban Cooperation Program, and we're part of that. That's a global movement to try to strengthen learning relationships between cities in other parts of the world. And Lisa Kavicia, our staff member, leads that for CUI, has worked on it for many years, knows these interns from when they were a bit younger, and she has been the one to help us put this session together. So Lisa, hats off to you. Thanks so much. CUI wants to continue to build connective tissue within the Canadian framework, but also with partners and city builders in other cities around the world. So how much of a treat is it for us to have you 4 joining us? So I'm going to ask you each for a little 90 seconds on why you're there. You can do 2 minutes even, on why you're there, what took you there, what your job is, I guess, and then what have you been seeing. So Marnie, let's go to you first in Athens.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to the Canadian Urban Institute. This is a fantastic series, and I've been following along from Athens at the time zones that I can, and yeah, great to see everyone and love a lot of the expat Canadian connection. So I have the good fortune of being married to a Greek Canadian. My husband is a freelance writer and editor, and we've been spending 6 months a year or so here for the last couple of years. And I used to work for the city of Vancouver in intergovernmental relations, and a year ago made the leap into consulting. So I've been doing urban affairs consulting. I'm an urban planner, good old University of Toronto graduate, and also went to, so I have communications, government relations background, so I've kind of become a bit of a honk, I guess is the term, not a hack and not a wonk, so I'm sort of in between. I've not heard that.
You're a honk.
Yeah, maybe not that flattering, but it's a niche that I've found, which is really fantastic. So I've been doing lots of work for European, particularly in the climate sector, so sustainable cities, resilient cities, climate, net zero cities, etc. So lots of exciting work with that. And lucky for me, I get to keep up my connections with Canadian clients, and I'm doing some work right now, mostly with the Global Covenant of Mayors, and they're based in Brussels, but they represent over 10,000 cities, big and small, fighting for climate action. So that's, they're in Brussels, but I'm in Athens right now because of COVID. So all exciting work all around.
Great. Okay. Why don't we do that? We'll just get general bios from each of you, and then I want to zero in on what you're seeing in COVID. So Danny, talk to us about you.
Yes. Thank you, Mary. And it's very nice to be back with the Canadian Urban Institute. As you mentioned, I was an intern all those years ago. And actually, I must say that while I was in Jamaica, it was when I was actually filling in the application to study in my master's program in Sweden. So I'm joining now from Stockholm, of course. So I came over to Sweden to study for my master's degree in sustainable urban design at the University of Lund, which is in southern Sweden, across the bridge from Copenhagen. And that was a little bit influenced by some of the reading I was doing at the time, Jan Gehl, who was in Copenhagen, and I discovered this university in Lund and So I kind of got caught up in the ideas of Scandinavian urbanism, and I wanted to come taste it for myself. Studied in Lund for a couple of years. And then since then, for the last 6 years, I've been in Stockholm working for a urban design and landscape architecture studio called Mandaworks. We're based in Stockholm. We actually have an office. A colleague of mine sits in Montreal. We're doing projects around the world, mostly in the Nordic regions. But like I said, we try to get around whenever we can and work on projects in China and North America and other parts of Europe.
Great. And where are you from originally, Dan?
Well, I'm a bit of a mix. I have a British citizenship, which is one of the reasons that allowed me to study in Sweden, actually. So I was born in England, in the South Coast, moved to Canada when I was 13, lived there until my mid-20s, and then moved back to Europe. So I've been bouncing back and forth over the Atlantic Ocean my whole life, basically. So.
And you have, I was trying to spot your accent, because you can have that. Yeah. I wondered actually if you might have been from Newfoundland, because there are people in Newfoundland that have a bit of an Irish lilt.
I often confuse people with my accent. I've been accused of having a mid-Atlantic accent because I have a bit of my British accent still, but then it's been worn away by living in Canada, and then maybe now even Sweden. I don't know. It's a mess.
I'm waiting for you to say A at the end of a sentence, and then I know you've got your Canadian cred. Okay, Charlotte, let's go to you in London, and just show the beverage that I was teasing you about, because during the tech check we did talk about it is cocktail hour in Britain.
Yeah, it's my Pim's cup, just so that you can identify me as the one in England.
Yes.
So I'm originally from Vancouver, but I moved to London in 2011 to do a master's here, to study, to become an urban planner. I had studied environmental science for my undergrad, but wanted to move into urbanism. And I've been here ever since. So my whole kind of career in urbanism has been in the UK. And I'm looking forward to hearing a bit about the Canadian context too, because sometimes I feel like I lose touch with what's going on in Canada, actually. So it'd be great to have the conversation in the round. I work as an urban planner for a planning consultancy called Quod, and I primarily work in infrastructure. So I work on getting consent for nationally significant infrastructure projects like airport expansions, or if you want to build a new railway or a new station on the underground. And I'm on the National Infrastructure Commission's Young Professionals panel because of that tie to infrastructure. So I'm just generally into infrastructure. It's pretty cool. And my professional world doesn't really focus on the sort of stuff that's going on with COVID, but it is everyone's talking about it. So it's been really interesting to kind of bridge that gap and understand what COVID means for infrastructure, which on the face of it, maybe there isn't the kind of direct link that there is to housing or there is to sort of open space, but there's definitely links. So it's been an interesting time to be in infrastructure, and in London too, because of the urban density, and the UK's definitely had a lot to deal with, a lot on its hands with the coronavirus. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Nicole, let's hear from you at last.
Thanks,
last
Mary.
but never least.
Thanks, Mary, and thank you so much for inviting me to present in the webinar. It's really great to see all of you and to be here with you. Well, I'm originally from Hamilton, Ontario. I attended the internship in Jamaica with Danny as well, and actually we, without knowing each other, applied to the same university. So I also attended Lund University. So that was a parallel path with Danny, and although in a different program. So my background is in sustainable development. I did a master's for 2 years in environmental economics at the International Institute based in Lund. And I spent 3 years there in total. And while I was doing my graduate thesis, my master's thesis, I stumbled upon, through my research, an urban innovation startup called CityMart, and that is what brought me to Barcelona. So my trajectory really was in urban innovation, sustainability, and I have been working ever since in the private sector, and now I'm back in kind of a hybrid at a public-private foundation that deals with tech policy and digital transformation, and that's called Mobile World Capital Barcelona. Maybe some of you are familiar with the Mobile World Congress. It's one of the world's biggest tech fairs for mobile technology here in Barcelona. over 100,000 people come, obviously not this year, but every year to the city. So it's quite a tech hub, and that's a huge part of Barcelona's identity and self-promotion to have that technological spirit. So that's what I'm working in, and that's what I'm passionate about. And it's great to be here with all of you again.
It's great to have all of you, and I'm interested about how each of you is acclimating to the place of the world in which you're living now, and I can hear it in the inflection in your voices. So it's tremendous, and it does tune one's ear. Some of us have that thing, you know. Honestly, I can get on the telephone with somebody from Britain, and then within 20 minutes, I've started to get a bit of a British accent myself, you know. So I know that we're all, susceptible to our environments, which is part of why urbanism matters. Is that the spatial environment that surrounds you and the people that surround you have an impact on how you see the world. So let's get to thinking a little bit together about what you've seen. I can give you a little quick, 10-second overview in Canada. What we would say is that the things that were dysfunctional in urban life before COVID have just become way more exaggerated and exacerbated off the charts. I use this expression, which I stole from Eric Kleinenberg, that it's a particle accelerator. And so here we are now with vulnerable populations that were disproportionately affected. Systems that weren't functioning at high levels are now really not functioning. And municipal governments don't have the money that they need to be able to actually provide. Well, they're just basically going into higher and higher levels of debt. So I think it's a wake-up call for urbanists to try to figure our way out of this as we come out of COVID. How are we, or as we continue to live with COVID, can we get down to the business of building cities and making the interventions that we've all known? And you're young folk who've just come out of school, some of you, you know that there are things that could be done that would make our cities better. And do we have a window to actually do them, I guess? So I want to hear from each of you, if you can. What do you think the particular challenge is that you've observed? When you call home and your family says, okay, what are you dealing with? Marnie, what do you say? What's the number one thing that you would observe out of Athens and the part of Europe that you have access to? What do you think?
I would say, in a word, it is resilience, because Greece, as you may know, or many people know, that it just had was emerging from a decade-long significant economic crisis. And they had a new prime minister that was voted in just under a year ago, and a new mayor in the last year, who happens to be the nephew of the current prime minister. So a lot of Greek dynasty politics there.
Handy.
Yes, it is for intergovernmental, for sure. But I've been noticing, and my husband's been writing about this as a freelance writer, but we've noticed this and definitely been talking about this quite a bit. There's quite a bit of international media about it now as well, that, in some ways, despite the crisis, that the fact that the health crisis is, and there's a migrant crisis, and on top of that, this pandemic, in some ways, Greeks have been, almost prepared a little more for this, I think, in many ways.
How do you mean?
Personal resilience. So, sort of sacrifice. There's been a significant amount of, I think, Canadians and North Americans particularly, we're not used to seeing kind of shortages or runs on money at ATMs and things. And that actually didn't happen here. So the grocery shelves were always stocked. People were very organized, very, disciplined with the very tight restrictions that came in. But I think there was sort of, a collective, we can do this. They wanted to be proud of the country for their response. And they were very proud to see a government having the state step back in a way that they hadn't seen, to see government playing a role and a leadership role. Just like, Dr. Bonnie Henry in BC and many of the scientists, they've got 6 o'clock news every day. They've gone down to twice a week now, but the lead scientist did a press conference, and Greeks, it was must-watch TV. And, you know, I think that the faith in the state and the collective will and the ability to see the numbers, and you know, there wasn't even really a curve to begin with, and they flattened it very quickly. So I think that the economic crisis, and we can talk a little bit more about this as well, but, you know, delivery service, like for example, local businesses were used to doing takeout delivery, very small amounts, €2 for a coffee, Freddo cappuccino, but they, you know, they adapted really quickly, I think, in some certain situations. And the municipalities, you know, not having a lot of money, just like many, but they've done very innovative things, like paved 80 roads in the last 2 months and done sewer works while there was no traffic. So I think they've been, you know, adapting, and because perhaps, and the worry is that the economic crisis will be so significant coming out of this, but I think there has been collective resilience, I would say.
You know, I just want to riff on that for a minute about the resilience idea. You know, I was in New Orleans for that very formative period of my professional life that's informed a lot of how I think now. And I watched how, as you suggest, personal resilience worked at the individual and household level. So, but, you know, there was pushback from communities still in New Orleans who resented being labeled resilient, because they thought that just basically gave us permission to do something more nasty to them, you know, because look at how resilient they are. But you're right that I wonder if European, and I'm interested in my colleagues, do you think that the European culture, not to be too generalizing here, has more visceral familiarity with scarcity, with systems breaking down? So did it mean that they were more psychologically prepared, do you think?
I think in London, yeah, I've felt as well that people have been very resilient, that the communities especially have really been, it almost feels like have been waiting for something like this to bring them together in the way that, you know, they harken back a lot to like the war effort, or having to deal with rations, or those kinds of times when things are tough and you've got to pull together, and that messaging comes through in the government messaging, and, you know, communities set up WhatsApp groups really quickly, and there were more offers of help than there were people to take them up, for sure.
Charlotte, do you think that the Brits were ready for some kind of unifying message, because you've been tearing each other apart for the last 3 or 4 years?
Yeah, it is interesting. It feels like very much at that local level, it has really brought people together. But then again, our sort of, the things that we've been tearing each other apart about have been sort of polarized, you know, regionally versus in cities anyway. So kind of hard to say. We haven't all been physically squeezed together. So
has COVID, I mean, you know, we watch the Brexit thing with great fascination here, the same way we watch the political dynamics in the US with great fascination. I was trying to pick my words carefully. But, you know, it did have a kind of urban-rural divide, didn't it? The Brexit discourse. And yet here we are with a pandemic that is affecting communities of all sizes, but we are seeing narratives that start to be anti-city again. But has it stitched together a new narrative for sort of Britain in the future?
I think, I mean, you know, you were kind of asking Marnie, like, what's the one thing that sort of characterizes, and I think what was popping to my mind was these tensions, right? Like tensions between the housing crisis that we've all been talking about for a long time across Britain. You know, in London it's very bad, but it is across Britain. And dealing with that, you know, again, going into a recession, people are talking about house building and solving the housing crisis as a potential thing to tackle, you know, the kind of recession that we might be facing. And at the same time, this discussion about density, this discussion about city building, these things are at odds with each other. And we're seeing it more, like it's really kind of embodied in the discussions about public transit right now, which in London, we have a congestion zone charge in the center of London. You know, it costs you money to drive into the center of London. That was an effort that we wanted to remove private vehicles from the center. It's been very effective. And they actually disapplied that while we were under stricter lockdown, because they felt like if you can't take the tube and you're needing to get into work,
you gotta get in there.
Yeah. Gotta get in there. So they disapplied it. And then as of, I think it was 2 days ago, they reapplied it and heightened it, because now people are talking about, you know, turning streets into cycle lanes and into, you know, pedestrianizing them, which is a big theme of kind of one of the big urban themes, I think, coming out of COVID. And there's just this weird tension where it's like they disapplied it for 6 weeks, and then when they turn it on even higher than it was before.
Higher.
Yeah, and so
have people are people with that decision? Do they feel comfortable with that decision, or are they saying, wait a second, we're still?
It depends if you have a car. It is very split, right? So on the articles that I'm reading about the kind of decisions, the City of London is actually a borough in London, and they're one of the first ones to have an active plan where they've published a map and they say, these are the roads we're going to close to cars. And that's generating, of course, huge debate. For the most part, people who work in the financial sector are able to work from home right now. But as they start to ease the lockdown, those tensions become, very real about we are hugely reliant in London on our train network or rail network, as well as the tube network to get people in. People just flood in on those trains.
Did the train and the tube the question for everybody, have your transit systems all stayed up and they've all been operating? And are they all still free, or are people charging now? Are you back to charging?
In London,
Athens continued charging.
Athens always charged right through. Okay.
Yeah.
What about you, Charlotte, in London?
Yeah, they continue to charge, and they're operating a limited service. And now they've reopened, I think, most tube stations, but there's they have people regulating social distancing.
And so there are fewer people in the trains or the cars, right? And
For sure.
Dan, what about you in Stockholm? What have they done there around transit?
The transit is kept running, and they've maintained charging. I think on some buses to minimize interaction with the driver that you didn't have to pay. But the way the fare system works in Stockholm, it's kind of like you tap your card and then you're in the system. So I think in the end,
already it was contactless.
Yeah, I mean, and actually that maybe would be very much what I would say about how, maybe I'm in a unique situation here, because I think in all the other cities, Stockholm hasn't had a lockdown actually. So so in Stockholm, it's a strange experience, because actually in many ways you haven't really felt the full effect of the coronavirus to much extent. There has been, of course, changes in the way that people are behaving, and there's been recommendations from the government, but in many ways, life has continued as normal. And it's been interesting to actually see that be discussed in the international media, which Sweden is usually not so spoken about. So it's really...
Population of Stockholm is?
It depends. The city itself is getting close to 1 million. The metropolitan is maybe 1.5. So it's also a smaller city when we compare it to Athens or London or Barcelona. And in many ways, the way that the city functions plays into kind of the social distancing rules in many ways. I think
you mean Swedes don't really want to hug each other a lot?
Well, that's the stereotype, right? And I would say I've lived in Sweden for 8 years, and it's true. It's definitely true. But people respect each other's distances in general. And so, of course, there's been regulations that have been passed down, but they're more like guidelines. I would say, Marnie, you mentioned resilience. I would say for Sweden, maybe the big word or the takeaway would be trust, because it's been quite remarkable to see how trusting the population has been towards the government's guidelines and recommendations towards the coronavirus. You would think if a government says, hey, look, we're going to kind of try this out and see what happens, which is basically how many people describe the Swedish approach, that there would be groups within that population that would stand up and say, hey, this isn't good, we don't like it, and cause problems.
Michigan.
Exactly. Yeah. But there's basically been none of that. And I live in the epicenter of the corona outbreak in Sweden. Like Stockholm is where it is. It's by far the worst.
And where is it, Danny? Is it in long-term care facilities, and is it in shelters and things like that? Or is it in concentrated areas, or do they know any patterning yet?
The place where the Swedish authorities are now stepping forward and saying, like, we've made a huge mistake was in elderly care homes. Yeah. And I think they'll see in the long run, maybe that will really be a terrible thing. There's already been quite a number of deaths because of it. But also the Swedish approach is that over the long term, they think that everyone is going to be in the same boat, and actually they're kind of playing the long game. That's politically how they are saying it. But what I meant about the city itself, when I think of Stockholm, is it's a city where people bike. It's a city where there's a lot of parks. It's a city that has a density, but it's
More
you know
living.
it's a bit lower. It's lower scale than maybe a London or definitely an Athens or Barcelona. I mean, it has an urban fabric which somehow allows you to move through it without coming into contact with lots of people. And I feel like in my life personally that, I mean, you meet your friends less, and there's a lot of things you don't do. But in many ways, I'm working from home, but life goes on maybe quite like it did before, which has been strange. Maybe a bit of guilt somehow that when I talk to others.
But survivor guilt.
Yeah, yeah.
Go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was going to say that I actually had a Skype call with Canadian colleagues, and I showed up with a haircut, and for 10 minutes the conversation was about that. People were quite provoked.
Haircut envy. Yeah, well,
I'm provoked.
I'm jealous.
Nicole, I want to go to Nicole next. It's interesting that the issues you guys were all raising around resilience and tensions and then trust. I'm interested too in, are there things to be watched and paid attention to around urban form and size? So are we saying a city is, or a unit, the optimal unit is, what is it? Vancouver has done quite well. Marnie, your hometown, and it's small. It's a small city, and is that versus Montreal that's been significantly challenged, and its density though is not high tower density predominantly, so we'll get into these things. I know some of your planners, but let's hear from you, Nicole, in terms of if you had to take one takeaway as your colleagues have, what would it be in Barcelona, do you think?
I think the word that comes to mind for me is one of solidarity, and also resilience, but especially solidarity in Barcelona. Maybe some of you know the mayor, Ada Colau. She comes from a background of activism. She is very pro-solidarity in her policies and in her speeches. So I think that has a lot to do with Barcelona as the city, speaking for the city, maybe not so much the citizens, reaction and response to the pandemic. I was looking into what kind of responses the city itself was giving, and there are a lot of really great initiatives, especially for children. I mean, the mayor has 2 children of her own. She's a mom, like she knows what parents are going through. People live in small apartments in Barcelona. There are very few houses like we're used to in Canada with a backyard. And we have one of the strictest lockdowns you can imagine. And these parents are trying to work from home. So you can imagine that, I mean, the fact that the mayor is aware of this, and that's one of the first things she demanded, let the children out, at least, if you can't let the adults. So I think that attitude of solidarity and just kind of, she's a citizen too, and she knows what we're going through is very powerful and very, very strong here. And one other takeaway I had was when Charlotte, you were talking about how, unfortunately, it takes these circumstances like these to get sort of more unity after division. The same thing happened here with Catalonia, the separatist movement, which was, it went through another surge just before this crisis. I mean, you had people burning containers in the streets. It looked like there were bomb explosions, the days after. And now you really see people kind of listening to the government. For being in Catalonia, that's, I mean, a big deal. And actually the protests you're seeing now after 2 months of lockdown are in Madrid, and you would expect to see them here. But in Barcelona, people are really, there's this culture of neighborly solidarity, which I would have to say is my main takeaway.
I wonder if some of this is the magic of localism, that somehow when we see it of something affecting our neighbors, are we more willing to lock arms with social distancing than if it's more abstract? I don't know. I'm playing with that in my own mind, trying to understand, because you just suggested this, Danny, that people have been remarkably trusting. And they, as you say, the suggestion that people are, you said, Marnie, that people listen to the science, that's been happening here too. You know, almost every Canadian knows who Bonnie Henry is. And they know that there's a Fluvog shoe named after her. You know, she's become a pop culture person, and it's been an interesting process to see that people are willing to do it. Now that may start to fray, I'm wondering, you know, and we're seeing it fraying south of the border. But do you think some of it is the power of local leadership? It sounds to me like each of you is citing a mayor or a particular local thing. What about you, Charlotte? Let's talk about that, because the UK is a different structure. London is the dominant unit, and your mayor has a whole different configuration. So tell us.
Yeah, and it's been interesting because the mayoral election was supposed to be this month, actually, and it's been postponed for a year, right? So Sadiq Khan is our mayor, and he is now not up for re-election until next year. So that's a whole other interesting thing. But I think that in the actually in the discourse, Sadiq has been relatively quiet. He has been there, if you are reading about transport, because he's the head of transport for London, or, you can find what he's saying, of course, but it's definitely been the messaging from Boris and his cabinet. And I find it interesting because especially in London, up until now, of course, there's been lots of criticism of Boris. And during this, it's kind of become quite quiet. I think there is this sort of sense of we have no idea what to do. We are looking for leadership. This is a moment where leadership is so important, and a joined up message and a government that isn't, a coalition that is saying different things and kind of using it to different political ends. I think people are really grateful to have a single strong majority for saying one thing. And so maybe that is partly why, I don't really know, but maybe that's partly why Sadiq has been a little bit more ignored, because it's sort of this isn't time for a Labour mayor to be saying, actually, I disagree with the kind of central government and we should be doing something else. There's just, we want clarity. We want a message, which is here's how we are as a nation going to get through this. And it's been kind of interesting that people have sort of shut up about their criticisms of Boris for this time. For the most part, there's still definitely criticism, but it's a lot quieter.
Yeah, Danny and Marnie, talk to us about local leadership. Has that been important in your particular purview? Yeah, Marnie, what can you tell us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit biased because I work with mayors on a daily basis, and I see how important they are. And I really have noticed Mayor Kostas Bakoyannis here in Athens, young, not just from the political dynasty, but tremendous leadership and coordinated with and here there's not so much a state or provincial government, so it's much more centralized. So that also helps. It's a small country, 11 million people. Athens metropolitan is 4.5 million, and it's not amalgamated, so it's very similar to BC, where there's 22 municipalities. So right. Athens itself proper is actually quite small geographically, but he's on the world stage. He's part of C40. He's part of GCOM, he's part of, the Resilient Cities networks and all these things. So, but he has been very prominent on Instagram and in his purview, disinfecting of the streets. And it's his name day today, which means, it's like a birthday, and he got a sanitation truck for his, a miniature one. And he's, he's all about this massive announcement last week in The Guardian and in the New York Times and other places about this called Great Walk. And it's a tremendous initiative similar to what you're seeing in Paris and Barcelona and other places, Milan, with green streets, car-free areas, and bold leadership from him in the purview of, this is a pandemic, this is an emergency. For physical distancing, we really want to see, space for pedestrians, and he's, getting rid of graffiti, and he's lighting the streets, and he's opening up the center of Monia Square that's been under renovation for 10 years. So, in the purview of urban intervention, he has been tremendous, and he's using the green recovery, hashtag to amplify that. So I think, to me, and I've seen this around the world, and I think, when you see an absence in some ways of national leadership or strong leadership and guidance, mayors are really stepping up. That's what I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that some of our chat participants are going to chime in about this, because I know that a lot of folks living in Canadian cities have a lot of envy about what's going on in terms of public space reallocation and the street program that Charlotte's mentioned, that you've mentioned. And Danny, when you talk about Stockholm, you know, lots of people would envy Stockholm pre-COVID, you know, as you suggested, you had livability amenities there that you made a commitment to, you know, decades ago, and now you're reaping the benefits of those, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, that it's almost that those decades of good city planning decisions in a moment like this. I mean, it's not planned out for a pandemic, but it, in a way, just by accident, it works out that way.
So maybe you had, you know, we talk about the malignant pre-existing conditions, the things that were not working that get manifested, but maybe some of the positive pre-existing conditions manifest too, right?
Yeah, maybe. And it's been interesting to see, thinking about public transport, because, for example, in Stockholm has one of the highest public transportation commuter rates in the world, I think. A crazy high percentage of people find their way to work using the metro or biking. But now, of course, people have been opting out of taking the metro, but instead they would change to bikes. Or so I take my bike to work, for example, and I do anyway. But I've seen that, for example, bike lanes have been much busier, even though people have started to move towards working from home. You see the people who are deciding, when they make a transportation shift, they're making it in the direction of biking. Now, that's maybe an anecdotal evidence based on me riding my bike. But I mean, in terms of the transportation choices that I'm seeing, I'm not seeing a lot more cars driving around, but I'm definitely seeing a lot more people on bikes walking around.
You know, I don't know. Do you think, I mean, this is part of the question that everybody's asking, you know, this term sticky. When you're in we were talking about how we're in this big honking global honk. I can't say honk anymore. This big sprawling global pilot. Like, we are a pilot right now, and as opposed to the King Street pilot or the Times Square pilot. And are some of the things that we're going to try, is this a chance to try something that should stick? And I'm hearing you, I mean, active transportation is obviously one of the big opportunities, and you've got local leaders who are acting on it. It seems here there's more caution. And I don't quite know if we understand what that's about. You know, Charlotte, you mentioned that there was some pushback in terms of the congestion price, for instance, the congestion charge returning, huh?
Yeah, there is some pushback, but again, it might come back to, like, there's also just not very much parking in central London, because we've had a congestion zone charge and great public transport for a long time, right? Like, kind of what Danny's talking about, you know, there's these good decisions that have been made and they sort of filter through. And so that the lobby is definitely still there for, like, you know, the kind of, we should get rid of the congestion zone charge, but people are used to that at least. And
but you had it before.
Yeah, and the argument is kind of around this, like, but what about black cabs? You know, very, very British, very London, and the black cab lobby is very strong. And are those a good thing in the crisis? Because you don't have to own a car, and sometimes you do need to get from A to B, and you can't make that trip on public transport, and they need to drive on a road. Or are they a bad thing because they could spread the virus more? You know, and there's just sort of, it's just not very clear what the direction of travel should be on that. So I think it's also hard to plan when we just don't know what the outcome, you know, are these temporary measures, are they permanent? Usually we have a very clear idea about that. And so that helps form the debate. You know, we're going to do this for 6 months. If it works, great, we'll consult again. We can all decide we're going to keep it or we can get rid of it. But with this, people are kind of not sure what the end game is. And it makes
it's hard because, you know, when they all started to say that transit would be free, that they do rear entry and free, I just thought, well, why would you ever reintroduce a charge then? Why don't you just leave transit free? Like, it's a bizarre thing, because how are you going to pay for it? But, you know, is that in fact ultimately what we should have, is that transit be free, forgetting about how you'd pay for it? Do you know what I mean? And similarly, when you're converting roads, making it easier for biking, making it easier for different kinds of transportations, aren't we in essence bringing in temporarily what are probably important ingredients to making urban life really work?
What is the future? Yeah, I think, I mean, especially around, like, you really see people walking on the pavements and looking at how much space designated for like a car that is empty and not doing anything. And before we just sort of accepted that, but right now where you know it's potentially putting you at risk, it feels crazy. And I think that that message is landing really strongly with a lot of people, which is great. I mean, again, I'm definitely reporting only on the London context here because there's a big like difference between rural areas in the UK and London.
But you know, do you think we have the political will to actually find ways to pay for these services? And I guess it's a question around infrastructure generally. Are we going to come through this? I mean, you were suggesting that, Marnie, that they've actually been building, they've been paving roads, they've been doing work through the pandemic. Yeah. Do you think we're going to come through this with a renewed commitment to building a certain kind of infrastructure, greener? Is it going to be politically possible, or is there just going to be tremendous pressure to build more roads? And what do people think?
I hope so.
Yeah.
You hope so? What? Which, Marnie?
I hope so. I hope that it'll shift, and I hope it'll be sticky, and I hope that, like we've seen in Canada, you know, the Minister of Infrastructure, Catherine McKenna, you know, making some announcements about shovel-worthy projects and not just shovel-ready. Like I'm hoping that there'll be, and we've seen national governments for Athens and Greeks, it's a big deal because they're getting included for the first time in Eurobonds for debt that they never were like eligible for before. You know, the power in Spain, I'm sure I'm keen to hear from Nicole about that, because I think, you know, like Spain and Italy, like Southern kind of Europeans, not lazy, hardworking, and absolutely, you know, need to have that kind of national and international level of support. Like there's just no other way to do it. You need the dollars.
How are you covering the costs? All of your municipalities must be spending money, like just hemorrhaging money like crazy. How are those costs being covered? Nicole, how are they approaching it in Spain?
Well, I know that the city is dedicating specific amounts of money, probably unplanned in their budget, to things. And I'm not aware of any specific plan on how they're going to recoup those costs, but I do know that, for example, in Spain, there are a lot of freelance workers. It's something that's kind of like a separate category of employment because there are just so many. And in the city itself, well, there has been like subsidies from the national government, but the city has been giving a one-off €300 payment to all the self-employed workers, which I think is great. They also have
Nicole, who offered that? Nicole, who's offering that?
Barcelona.
Wow, the city is paying money to freelancers.
It's to supplement the subsidy from the national government that freelancers are getting in small businesses. So it's really, I think they're not thinking of right now maybe how they're going to recoup those costs, but they just know that these people live month to month, and they just need to make ends meet. And as well, they have, the city, again, a €25 million fund for SMEs. A lot of shops in Barcelona are small businesses, and they want to see those businesses survive. Speaking of infrastructure, I think as you know, tourism is very important in Barcelona, and we've gone from over 30 million tourists a year to 0. And one of the priorities has been also that they want the restaurants and bars to keep the same amount of space, but still be able to socially distance. So while they will dedicate more street space to more sustainable transportation modes, they will also allow terraces and patios to expand so that they can retain the same amount of capacity as before. And I think it's a really interesting example of how different cities, different priorities, they're trying to put money where their mouth is.
You know, we've got something going on called Bring Back Main Street, and we're concerned about what are the kinds of supports and environments, what are the enabling conditions to allow entrepreneurs and businesses to get back on their feet. Any other thinking on that, Danny, in terms of it sounds to me as if you're not, because you haven't locked down the way the others have, you may not be facing the same financial catastrophe that the rest of us are, or are you?
Maybe not to the same extent at this moment, but I think, of course, there will be consequences that are in line with other countries and cities. Sweden, it's a smaller country. There's a population of 9 million people. Most of of course, also Stockholm's the capital. So a lot of the funding is coming through the state. And there's a long history and tradition in Sweden of the state being kind of the social backbone. And it was interesting to hear Marnie, Charlotte, and Nicole talk about the different local contexts, because I would say in Sweden, it's much more based on that you look to the government rather than your neighbor. And that's very much the Swedish way, is that you don't need a neighbor because the government's there for you whenever you need it. And I mean, it shows up, it really is there for you when they say that. And I mean, that's exaggerating a bit, but it's not so far off the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't felt much of a kind of this local surge, but more kind of the representatives on the state level coming forward and having to be much more accountable for the decisions they're making, and the national and state agencies providing huge amounts of support to businesses and companies, and saying they basically are trying to avoid layoffs.
Right.
So they're saying, look, we'll pay your employees. I mean, we will cover the cost difference. You can apply for this funding, and it's basically all happening like this.
What about vulnerable populations, folks? Has there been any kind of an adjustment in terms of shelters, people that are mental health challenges, people that are street involved? How has the response worked for those constituents?
Maybe I can just say very quickly, like I saw that from Lisa in the question because in Stockholm, one of the criticisms has been that in the outskirts or the suburban neighborhoods, that they are facing a higher pressure from the virus than other parts of the city. So it's more they're lower income neighborhoods. They're maybe from immigrant backgrounds, and there has been some criticism, but I have not heard any response to it, to my knowledge. Maybe there is, but it's something that's kind of arising, an emerging narrative.
We have an advocate here in Canada, Jay Pitter, a woman of color, who's talking about forgotten densities, and that there are, while densities being touted as the environmentally preferred option, there are people that are living in inadequately ventilated, overcrowded, no public amenities, etc. Marnie, what about the vulnerable populations in Athens? Has there been
It's been really impressive. Early on, the national government and the local governments put together hotlines for mental health issues for people of all ages, focused on seniors, focused on youth, all ages. Definitely focused. They've also opened up. They just had the mayor just toured the new president, first female president ever of the country, the last couple of days, a big facility downtown Athens for homeless. I think they have 400 beds. And I do some volunteer work with unaccompanied minor refugee children who up to 18 years old, and they are all, there's lots of them that are homeless, but like the foundations have really kicked in and found shelter. IKEA Foundation, for example, and others have found shelter. So there's been, considering that Greek culture is very much about family, and you sort of look after your own, and you don't necessarily think, people don't necessarily think about the homeless population in the same way that we might in Canada. You don't see the kind of street homelessness, but there's been a really impressive focus on that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if you were thinking now, based on your practice and how you're applying your various skills and your perspective, this is going to be an event that's going to shape the future of your work life. As I said, I was 45 in New Orleans through Katrina, and that had an indelible impact on my appreciation for how I think community-based resilience emerges, because I watched it. So as you think about that, as you continue in your professional lives, wherever you end up living, whatever you end up doing, are there takeaways that you feel now you need to champion, that's going to inform your work, whatever your next job is, wherever your next gig is? Do you have a sense of that, or is it too early to know? Nicole?
Oh, mine is a big yes, and I can give a very concrete example. Well, as I mentioned, I work in tech and digital transformation, and in Spain, there's a bit of a resistance to working from home and telework, but this crisis has been the main driver of digital transformation in so many workplaces. And one of them is the public sector. So I learned that there are 14,000 employees working for the city of Barcelona. Before this crisis, only 200 of them were equipped to work from home.
Wow.
Within 2 weeks up to 7,000 of them were able to work from home. And this was because like an amazing, fast learning curve, but amazing resilience and collaboration of the tech community, of the private sector, public sector working together, and people just like willing to, okay, this is the new reality. So for me, the big takeaway is digital transformation is a reality, and maybe it's a learning curve for some people, but it's a necessary one.
Nothing like a crisis, eh?
Absolutely.
Nicole, what do you say about, I mean, you, again, a lot of people have Barcelona envy because of, well, you're mayor, but also the courageous things that you've done around housing, access to housing, but also that you've somehow been the leader in integrating tech in a way that's seen as, I think, having more of a social justice angle to it. That people haven't resisted it, whereas there's more anxiety here that it's about privacy and surveillance, capitalism and everything. Do you think the digital piece can be integrated in a way that increases inclusion and livability for everybody?
It has to. The answer is that it just has to, and I think that's the attitude of the city. There's a movement that, I mean, we're part of in my organization for technological humanism, they call it. So putting people first, people-centered technology and society-centered design. And so, yeah, we're questioning those things. Barcelona has a great platform called Densities, which is a citizen deliberation online platform. They're also using it now for COVID to come up with co-created citizen initiatives, and they do question these things, and there's an open debate online and offline that they try to be very inclusive about that, and I can see it even as an expat that I think it's working.
So society-centered design, co-creation, people first. These are great programs. We'll put them into the chat so people can see them. Sure. So you think so you feel that that's something that you can emerge from this committed to really get to the next stage to champion, eh? You think that's the sticky thing?
Yes, I think so. And I think these contact tracing apps, people are questioning them, and they kind of have what we also do in the foundation is try to promote this digital literacy, so people actually can ask critical questions about technology and not just download an app on their phone because the government tells them to. They want to know what does this do, and what privacy implications are there, and they can ask those questions. So we try to take what the Congress brings, so all of these tech giants, to the city, and bring that also to people with a week of free events and lectures and workshops for free, so citizens can have that digital literacy.
This notion of how we can blend public and private, that somehow they can coexist in a way that delivers benefits for everybody, eh? Yeah. People want to know clearly what it was you said, Nicole. Can you repeat the phrases you had? You had, someone is saying, was it technology tooism? I don't know what it was. What exactly are the phrases you were saying? Go for it again.
Sorry, it was technological humanism.
There you go. Karen Ramsey Klein, technological humanism. Okay, we'll
I'm not drinking Tim's, but
That's great. Technological humanism. Oh, Lisa caught it too. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
So, Danny, you talked about trust.
Yeah.
And what Nicole is suggesting, I think, is that there needs to be some kind of elevated trust that's going to get us to propel forward. Do you see that as sticking?
It was actually exactly what I was just reflecting on when I was listening to Nicole and thinking about my work, actually, because some of the things you've mentioned today, Mary, are talking about urban functions and kind of how the pandemic can be changed for the better due to the pandemic. But when I think about the pandemic, it's anti-urban in many regards. It's kind of something that threatens in high density situations. It's sort of when you have a lot of people mixing together. I think about my work as an urban designer or landscape architect. You're creating public spaces where you want to invite people to mix, to come together. It's almost like the pandemic is working directly against what I've been trying to do my whole career, really, which is, split this all up, right? And I wonder, I would actually be curious to hear from the rest of you if actually this anti-urban narrative is something that has emerged anywhere. In Stockholm, it hasn't, but in your cities, it's denser, and maybe maybe people are starting to get a bit wary of each other. And like you say, Mary, that trust starts to degrade. Because the other thing, it's similar to what happened a little bit when the terrorist attacks were happening around Europe, is that entering into public space became an act of participating in some kind of relationship with a bunch of strangers, which it always is. But when you have this thing happening behind the scenes on this global scale, you're thinking about it and you're wondering, hey, did this person check themselves for symptoms, or are they out here when they shouldn't be? So you're all the time negotiating in this process of kind of, can I trust this person I'm with? And I wonder, these things that have happened to us over the last decade, and I kind of group the pandemic in with these other acts of terrorism, even though it's quite different in many ways, but it's maybe eroding some of this public trust, or has the potential to. I wonder if any of you felt those effects.
It's interesting that, people predicted this, of course, after 9/11. And, cities have survived pandemics for centuries, and people have a period of time where they are distrustful of a public good. Could be water that gave them cholera or whatever it is, right? And weather will adjust. Let's see. So what do you think, Charlotte? Britain has struggled with all sorts of threats to public space, and terrorism is a good example, Danny, where actually public space right now might be one of the safest places to be. Because there's ventilation, outdoor public spaces. But what do you think, Charlotte? What's the one thing that you're going to wonder about, and what's going to inform your work going forward?
Yeah, I think so. In response to kind of what Danny was talking about, and whether this could breed sort of distrust in densely populated areas, I think we've talked about it a lot, and I feel happy that I haven't seen it. I haven't felt it. I really haven't felt it. I've felt like people are actually, more in touch with their communities, and that has strengthened, if anything. People are certainly out in the parks. They're not staying away from those public spaces at all.
Picnics. You were saying it's all about picnics.
Oh, we love a picnic over here. Absolutely. Yeah. First thing on everyone's to-do list was get out there with the picnic blanket.
I wonder if we're going to default to trust. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so Charlotte, you finish, and then I'll go to Marnie. Go ahead, Charlotte.
Okay. Yeah, I think I just on what would I would take forward into my practice. I think one of the things is really comes back to what Nicole was saying about the human aspect, and because I work in infrastructure, it tends to be a very technical, engineering-y, serious discipline, and this has really shown like we've had to talk about infrastructure in the context of coronavirus, and it is a very human problem, and it's brought those conversations closer together, and I think for the better. I think we'll have to think about the human angle much more when we plan infrastructure going forward, and I think that's a good thing that I'll take out of this. Yeah,
it's really reminded us that cities are for people.
It has.
Marnie, last word to you. What's the piece that's going to stick for you as you carry on in your career?
Well, definitely the work I've been doing is that kind of multi-level governance. And I think, like all levels of government, like in Canada, we talk about the four corners of the table: federal, provincial, municipal, and First Nations. And I think, but it's also that kind of what Nicole and Charlotte and Danny have been talking about, society, business, and the opportunity to see how the inequities, like there's no better time to be really addressing them. And I'm hopeful that people are addressing that and realizing, it takes all hands on deck. It's not just government. There's a role for industry. There's a role for community and nonprofits and all the work that everyone's doing. So not to be naive about it, but I definitely feel like that kind of collaboration is going to be more important than ever. And I just can't see how big, bold solutions to these societal changes and the looming, climate crisis, which is not going away, is absolutely got to be the focus for people moving forward.
It'll be interesting to see if this is going to compel us together, gang, to really come up with some collective solutions. Well, I feel really inspired listening to you four and hearing how you're approaching your work as Canadians working in other places. Your country is proud of you, and we appreciate you taking a moment to just share what you're seeing and what you think the real implications are of this work. And we wish you well, and really want to thank Marnie, Charlotte, Danny, and Nicole from tuning in and telling us about what's going on in cities around the world. And we appreciate your feedback, and we're going to take it to heart as we build trust and resilience, and we come to terms with our transitions and tensions, and we look at what I'm counting on you, Nicole, that you're right, that we can create, what was it? Technological, give it to us again, technological.
Humanism.
We're going to become technological humanists. Hurrah. Thanks, everybody. Really great to see you. Tomorrow, midday, we're with the mayor of Barrie and the mayor of St. John's to talk about what's really going on in smaller communities across the country. Tune in at noon Eastern to City Talk. Thanks very much again, gang. Really great to see you.
Keep up the great work. Thanks.
Thanks.